Good afternoon, happy Monday, and thank you for taking the time to take a look at this conversation, whether you're live with us in the moment or catching this on the internet afterwards. My name is Josiah Gilliam, and I work in the Office of Equity in Mayor Bill Pedutos' office as the My Brother's Keeper coordinator. And we've been doing a series of conversations exploring realities related to COVID and equity, the different pieces of the puzzle that we have going for us here in Pittsburgh and in the region, and really just taking the time to kind of create a platform to do a deeper dive on these. And this is a conversation I've been really looking forward to, not just because of the cross-cutting relevance of the themes and topics, but because it's a very important area and sphere within work in Pittsburgh. And there's a lot of people working within it, but it's something that's very complicated, something that I feel like in my time in the mayor's office and working in the nonprofit space, I've had some chance to learn about, but here's a real opportunity to learn from experts in some of those different spaces. So without further ado, I'd like to start with just a brief round of introductions of everyone that's going to be on the call with you today, and then we'll start to drill into it. Before we do that, a couple quick points. First of all, we have a couple of ASL interpreters along for the ride for us today. We have Iris and Megan, and you'll see them at different times throughout the broadcast. We want to thank them for their time and for helping us be more accessible with these broadcasts. At a certain point during this conversation, we're going to talk with some officials from the Urban Redevelopment Authority, and they have some slides, some PowerPoint slides that they have prepared that'll help walk us through the resources and the structures at play there. And when that is being shown, right, currently we don't have a way to have the interpreters on the screen at the same time. So we apologize for the inconvenience. It'll be fixed in editing so that if you're looking at this video after the fact, you'll be able to see both. But for those of you that are following on a live broadcast, it'll just be the PowerPoints there. So we appreciate your patience and grace as we try to continue to work with Zoom and Facebook and the tools at our disposal. All right, let's get to the introductions. We'll start with the Office of Equity and the mayor's office. What I'd like for each of you, your name, your role, and the kind of perspective that you're bringing to this conversation about housing and equity. We'll start with Deputy Chief of Staff, Majestic Lane.
Good afternoon, Josiah, and thank you for this. It's a really important conversation. I think we'll get into some things about it. But I'm Majestic Lane, Deputy Chief of Staff and Chief Equity Officer for Mayor Peduto. And, without going too far into it, I think this kind of conversation is one of the central conversations of, how cities are going to function and flourish going forward, especially given the conditions that we have right now.
Thank you, sir. And now Oliver Beasley.
Thank you, Josiah. Good afternoon as well. Oliver Beasley, policy analyst, and my portfolio broadly around equity under Chief Lane, more targeting some points, though economic, community, and workforce development would be some of the my main focus areas, but typically it's equity throughout the work that we do within the office and within the different departments here at the City of Pittsburgh.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for being here. We have Monique Pierre from the Housing Authority with us today. Very excited about this. Ms. Monique.
Hello, my name is Monique Pierre. I'm the Chief Development Officer here at the Housing Authority for the City of Pittsburgh. And where I think I am in this space is not only an example of an opportunity or of bringing equity, but also in the role of helping to bring equity through housing and affordability and making sure that the resources are there as well for residents in the city that are deeply impacted by in terms of economic equity and the ability to have housing stability.
Terrific, thank you so much. And finally, we have a couple officials from the Urban Redevelopment Authority. You may hear me say URA on the call because I'm used to speaking in alphabet soup. We'll start with Ms. Jessica.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jessica Smith-Perry, and I'm the Director of Housing Lending for the Urban Redevelopment Authority, or URA. And the URA, we're very involved with the development of affordable housing, the preservation and other housing resources for all of Pittsburgh's residents. And when we do this, we craft our programs and try to make sure they're as equitable as possible. So later today, you'll hear about that.
Thank you so much. And last but not least, Bettina.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bettina Haig, and I'm the Housing Strategy Officer within the URA. So I work primarily in the Housing Department with Jessica. I'm very happy to be on this call. I think this is a really, really important conversation to have, and I'm really interested in learning the different ways that equity intersects in all of these different organizations on the call.
Thank you so much. All right, well, let's just jump right in. You know, we have some time to spend on this, and I'm excited about that. Chief Lane, I'd like to begin with you just to help us frame this conversation conceptually. You know, there's some terms here that we hear an awful lot, both in the city and in the work that we do, but they also can seem like they loom large over a lot of other conversations. So when we think about the conversation we're going to have today around housing, around equity, around realities related to COVID, around this idea of like challenges before and now challenges moving forward, how should we think about these things, and what are we here to talk about today?
Yeah, and thank you. I think one of the big things we need to look at, you know, there are a lot of symptoms of structural and institutional racism, and when we look at these things like police brutality, things like health disparities, these are all symptoms of broader kind of challenges. And affordable housing is one of the biggest symptoms of the system that we have right now and its impact on people, largely people of color, but also obviously folks who find themselves to be, you know, in low to moderate income situations. But it's really important to see it as a symptom of a broader cause, because you can look at the piece of affordable housing as people don't have these things, and then we have to, and as you'll hear on the call, we're looking to respond in an ecosystem-based way, acknowledging that whether it's the city or the Urban Redevelopment Authority or the Housing Authority or any of the myriad of other people, community-based organizations, activists who are working towards these kind of issues, identifying what's going on in the community and speaking on that it has to be an ecosystem of having this conversation around it, but that it also, when people can't afford housing, it has connections to do with the opportunity gap in education. It has everything to do with, the median income in the city. And as a city, we were known at one point for being a relatively kind of inexpensive city or low cost Rust Belt city. But as many of the things that have happened in our city, which are generally positive, have happened with tech companies moving, the expansion of universities, businesses taking root, neighborhoods becoming revitalized and hot, if you will. Some of the other challenges with that have been folks who were living in neighborhoods for generations now find themselves not able to be there. And as some of these things changed, their incomes didn't change, right? As the housing went up in East Liberty, or the housing went up in Lawrenceville, or the housing went up in Mexican War Streets, everyone's salaries didn't. Everyone's educational opportunities didn't rise at the same time and at the same scale that the housing rose. So we found ourselves now dealing with the real challenge that you have to deal with the symptom, but you also have to look at what are some of the other things that lie beneath those things. And these were challenges that we were having prior to this. As many people know, approximately 2 years ago, the Mayor Support Council voted for a $10 million a year fund for affordable housing explicitly to be able to deal with some of the challenges that we were starting to see, and that were starting to have a huge impact on many of our neighborhoods, namely East Liberty, but not limited to East Liberty. And so while we have trying to be really thoughtful around it, we know that the challenge around economic inequality has continued to expand. And so what you will hear today is a response, and the way that we're trying to engage it, acknowledging that you have to do more, but we're trying to respond to the challenge around affordable housing and workforce housing and accessible housing, because we know that across the country, and Pittsburgh is no different, you find that people that used to live in communities in the city now find themselves living further out because housing is cheaper there, but there are also other costs that are paid when folks are moving deeper into the first ring suburbs. They then find themselves away from their communities. They find themselves away from their connections and their social capital. And also they often find their children away from schools and whatever have you. And they have increased transportation costs at a time where the cost of gas and everything is going up. So what we've seen is a bargain that many people are having to make. That is an unfair bargain. in our society. But what we're trying to do is really figure out how can we use the resources that we have to continue to scale. And I think you'll hear about that. But COVID actually adds another element to it. And that goes from what is a challenge of American cities across the country to then looking at the relationship between health disparities and places to live. And also it cuts bare the economic realities when so many things are closed down because of the virus. You then find people not able to work. And as people are not able to work, you find that they're not able to pay their rent. And when they're not able to pay their rent, you know, in many situations, the folks are in danger for an eviction. So you'll hear today about some of the responses that we've made as a city to looking at, you know, some of those challenges and some of the new kind of innovations that I think will be really interesting to look at going forward, at how do we do some eviction protections. And this has been conversations between the city, judges, nonprofit organizations, really trying to say, how can we all come together to acknowledge that when people are evicted and people have to leave their homes, they bring us another level of trauma. And we know that level of trauma that they face are then larger issues that show up other places. So if it shows up in the quote unquote criminal justice system, or if it shows up in our educational system with young people, if it shows up in the Department of Human Services for the county, that we know these things show they don't go anywhere. So it's really about how does government, you know, kind of respond and pivot and acknowledge how to be as innovative as possible, to be as flexible as possible, with the goal of maintaining, you know, especially vulnerable populations to not find themselves in even worse conditions given what we're dealing with the virus. So I would just leave with saying, again, one of the biggest challenges with the affordable housing conversation is seeing it is a broader inequality conversation. It is one of the largest symptoms of the broader inequality conversation. So while you can solve it in the short term through many of the programs that you'll hear about, in a broader sense, until there is the higher level of equality, and you reduce income inequality, you reduce wealth inequality, and you reduce the basis of all people to have opportunities to what we would consider a moral standard as far as clean, affordable housing, that these issues will continue to spin out. And it takes the work of everyone working together to be able to create an environment where all Pittsburghers have a pathway to that opportunity. So thank you.
Thank you for that. I really appreciate that response, because it does a really great job illustrating why this is in many ways a unique challenge, but why it's also so interesting, because it's within this one theme, this one topic of say housing, or even like a smaller scope, affordable housing. And yet you're talking about an ecosystem of response, organizations in government, organizations in our nonprofit space, developers, et cetera, education space. You start to pull the thread on this one thing of housing, and you start to touch all these different realms. I'd like to talk a little bit about your perspective on the administration's response, the mayor's leadership here, because one of the first things that I encountered when I joined the mayor's office team was the announcement of a partnership with GARE, the Government Alliance on Racial Equity, as I understand it. And part of that was a citywide training where we talked about racial equity toolkits, what it looks like to take an equitable decision-making framework when it comes to hiring, procurement, and contracts. We have experts on this call that could do a deeper dive, and I believe we're actually going to do a whole conversation, one of these, around GARE, so we don't have to get into the weeds too much. But one of the parts of that experience that was really impactful to me, where I felt like I learned a whole lot, and where it really impressed upon me that how many people from the city are here, was this moment where we took a look at the history of housing in the region, and how you could look at different ways that cities or municipalities have thought about development, and you can look at displacement, and you can look at progressive programs. You can do all of these things within this one sphere. So you mentioned the idea of success looking like everyone kind of playing their role or putting their piece of the puzzle together. How is the administration focused on this? You mentioned the trust or the affordable housing fund and all of that. How has Mayor Peduto and the administration tried to improve this conversation and be a force for good within it?
Yeah, and so one, I don't want to create any illusions like this is easy, because if it was easy, people would have figured it out and we wouldn't have the problem. Because it is an indicator of the larger challenges in our society. Affordable housing is complicated. It's a complicated thing to be able to do. One, whether you're doing the explicit, kind of work that the Housing Authority and the Urban Redevelopment Authority does, and they'll talk about that. But it's also the broader conversation around, how do we interact with everyone to be able to engage? So, the work that the URA has done around the Housing Opportunity Fund with Pittsburgh United, really kind of engaging in communities and talking to people and being able to do some engagement. The work we've done with Omasello around the ambassadors talking to these things. And when we found ourselves in the current situation, we saw that housing and housing stability and housing vulnerability was one of the largest challenges that we had. So with the kind of first infusion of CARES resources, we had to make sure that we worked, really in step with the URA and also the Housing Authority to really see what resources were out there for families who would be housing vulnerable. We know that the affordable housing issue has been a challenge long before we were part of GARE, and it's been long before, COVID. But one of the things that has really come out of this is the mayor wanted to really see where is a central place, right? Because a central place that people can access resources and access what's going on and things that they can find. Because what you find is when a city with so many different nonprofits and such a strong civic sector, that there's information everywhere, but there's often not a one-stop shop, if you will. And especially in this day and time, a virtual one-stop shop. So as an extension of the work with GARE was really to try to see how could, since we know everyone's online, or is a lot of people online, not everyone's online, a lot of people online. And we want to really be able to see how can people go find what they need in a simpler way that we can cut some of the bureaucracy and actually cut some of the challenges that families find themselves dealing with. And that kind of morphed into the HARP website, the housing, resource portal, which I'll, let Oliver talk more about. But that was really one of the genesis, the mayor's insistence in making sure that there was a central place that people could access the information that they needed to then be able to find what they needed to talk to the appropriate folks. So it's all part of the extension and acknowledging, again, like you talked about, the wealth that was created, due to housing, and also the limitations that were created for others due to housing. And these issues we still find ourselves grappling with, right? So even something that was a 20th century challenge is a 21st century problem. And I think it is the problem of a lot of cities that are really going to have to continue to wrestle with it. And, it is housing stabilization, but it's also a path to opportunity. It's people making $15 an hour. It's people being able to have access to education. It's people being able to have access to great education no matter where they live in a city, so that, not one neighborhood is better than another neighborhood when it comes to education. So here's all the things that we know, and giving people access to high opportunity neighborhoods, which is some work that the Housing Authority has been working on for some time. So there's a collection of things that we're putting together, as a mosaic of sorts, really to be able to we're not just throwing it all in and saying, here you go. We're really kind of putting things together based on where people are and what is that pathway to opportunity that they need.
I appreciate that. Oliver, let's go to you, sir. I'd like to hear more about the portal, but this is your first time on these calls. So if you wouldn't mind, would you mind introducing yourself and how you came to do this work with the mayor's office now, because it's not your first stop in the public sector?
Thank you. So again, my name is Oliver Beasley. I'm a policy analyst here with the administration. It's not my first stop in the public sector. I internship for I had a few internships on city council and with the state state senator Fontana. Aside from that, it was this administration is my first deep going and really challenging with all the policy work. A lot of my other work was a lot of programmatic and research, where this is the bulk of my policy experience.
Okay.
But more so speaking to HARP, again, which is the Housing Assistance Resource Portal, some conversations came up that how do we, within the broad strokes of equity, and how do we create more access and opportunities and limit barriers? There were a bunch of programs through the city, through the URA, through the Housing Authority, and through some of our nonprofit partners that existed already for housing that we just wanted to bring more momentum and focus to. So it was just, does it make sense for us to make kind of a one-stop shop, just one place with all the information that's easily accessible and easily digestible for as many residents as possible. And I say as many residents as possible because it is accessible through, of course, the website, and then also 311 if you do not have access to readily, if you don't have ready internet access. And essentially it's just a drop down of questions asking you your age, your AMI, what you're looking to do, if you're looking to rent, if you're looking to buy, if you're currently experiencing homelessness, if you're looking, if you're a landlord looking to expand your services, just so that we are continually and trying to be diligent about housing and how we're assisting residents with housing issues.
Thank you for that. So it's a great idea, right? So you mentioned this idea, there's resources in different places. How can we have a one-stop shop? So to execute on that idea, you put together a website, but just because you have a website doesn't mean that it's automatically accessible. One of the things I heard you all working on when it came to this website was incorporating different languages so that more folks could understand the information presented. Could you speak a little bit about what that looks like? Because it's not like, you can just now start typing in a different language.
Yes, so it was with a great help from our IMP department that we were able to gain this software that essentially, as soon as you access the website, you have the option to drop down, and there are options for, I believe, somewhere close to 20 different languages, and then it just translates all the content on the website to that language, and then as you're implementing it, changes all the documents as well, so you're able to access it from that standpoint. I believe it's up to 20, it may be over 20 now, but last I checked, it was like close to 20.
That's impressive work. One last question for you, sir, and then we'll move to the Housing Authority. One of the first time I've been advised that sometimes there are younger folks that are watching these calls. And one of the first experiences when I joined the mayor's office team that you were a part of was we had a chance to talk with some young men that are part of the Urban League's Black Male Leadership Development Initiative, BMLDI. And you mentioned how you'd been working in kind of a programmatic and research space, and now it's more policy. If you were to imagine kind of addressing that same group of young men or a similar group of young men, explaining the work of government as you see it and what you do, how would you describe that for any young people that might be watching us today?
Yeah, so thank you for that. That we absolutely did do that. That was a good day. And I think I'm appreciative of them coming down and giving us that experience. So programmatically and from a research standpoint, it's all kind of tagged in the policy. So because you have good programs for specific unmet needs and for different populations and for different things, and then the research and policy just comes into how do you make these things better, or as you're doing the programs. So Josiah, you coming from Homewood Children's Village and you being good at the programs that you're in, I'm sure you've seen different areas of we can improve this to be better and we can improve that to be better. And even now in the work that you do now and the work that we do in the office, how do we continually make things better, or what is missing, or what demographic we're not touching? I seen that from a policy perspective, we're able to affect it more efficiently and on a larger scale versus trying to grapple and battle with programs from trying to maybe change something in the program that's already written from a legislative standpoint or from a grant standpoint. So this just on the front back end, just getting into the nuts and bolts of seeing how you would like to adjust something to make it better or more efficient.
I appreciate that. Monique, I'd like to turn to you, certainly something you can speak to in terms of the blend of programming and policy from the Housing Authority. But you're also someone that's relatively new to the region. And I wondered if you wouldn't mind taking a moment to share a little bit about your history and how you come to be working at the Housing Authority at this moment in time.
Sure. Thank you for having me. I'm really pleased to be here. Well, I've started off my career in housing approximately 22 years ago in October. And over the course of time, I did everything from working in resident services, providing services and supports for residents living in Detroit public housing up until now. And over the course of those 22 years, I've had an opportunity to serve at the state, the local, the county level, in looking for ways to effectively deliver those services, effectively deliver supports, effectively develop housing so that individuals who may be traditionally overlooked or underhoused, not properly housed, or who are housing unstable can find a healthy place to live where they can thrive. My first introduction to housing was actually through my dad. And I was, when I was a kid, our house was taken through an eminent domain action. Our entire neighborhood was bulldozed and they put up a warehouse. Growing up in West Michigan, that is a smaller community. However, it was very impactful. And my dad became involved as a housing commissioner, and he introduced me to housing and showed me through his actions that it's positive to have and it's possible to have a positive impact on your community, and that housing, being a basic need, is one of the most impactful ways that you can have a positive outcome for people in the community. So over the years, I've worked in California, Alabama, and now I'm here in Pittsburgh.
And we're grateful for it. So let's start with a couple of definitions just to level set for the rest of the conversation. And you already started speaking a little bit to, so some terms here: housing unstable or housing insecurity, these different things. Let's start with an institutional question, and then we'll get to some of these terms. If you were to describe the housing authority to a group of young people, how would you go about doing that? And how would you describe the relationship of the housing authority to the city of Pittsburgh, to the URA?
If I were to describe it to a group of young people, I would say the housing authority is an avenue and a tool. It's an avenue for people who are interested in impacting positively the community. It is an avenue for them to be able to do that. Anyone who works here knows that it's about having a passion for the change that we want to see as far as housing and improving the quality of housing of the folks in the community. I would describe the work that we do as both service and as practical in the development of housing. So we develop affordable housing, meaning that we develop housing that, but for public dollars or the support of the federal government, there would not be an opportunity to build it because it's very expensive to build and very expensive to operate. The second part of that, as far as how I see the relationship between the housing authority and the URA and the city, is that we are part of one body. There is no separation as far as I see from the type of work that we do. We both serve the same populations. We both have a concern for the individuals in the city. The URA, the city, and the housing authority work in tandem most of the time on the development deals that we do here to develop housing. And of course, our citizens of this city take advantage of the housing that we provide through the housing authority. So we have a very dynamic relationship, and I think that it's very positive.
Wonderful. And you're also part of a leadership team of folks that are equity focused in some of these different entities. Can you speak a little bit about that and the thinking behind why you all work together so much?
Well, the reason we work together so much and so well is because housing is a basic human need. It's something that you have to have in order to stabilize for all of the other successes that you want to have in life. And so any municipality has the ability to provide the support and the environment that they want to see for the residents that live in their communities. Housing being, of course, the basic need means that you're able to come in with funding and you're able to look at ways that you can creatively problem solve around providing that basic need.
Okay, so let's talk about housing and some of the related terms, because when you're describing the work that you do, how would you define some of the more pertinent terms? I've heard affordability, housing itself, basic needs? What just comes to mind for us that we should know going into it?
So affordable housing is really a simplistic term. I like to look at it as housing exists on a certain continuum or an affordability spectrum. So there's housing that's affordable to individuals that have a higher income, a higher wage, and there's housing that's affordable for individuals who have no income. And everybody exists along that breadth or that span of affordability. And so the way that I define affordable housing is that housing that is affordable to the individual that is in need of that housing. And to further explain, individuals who have low or no income need more support in order to exist somewhere on that housing continuum. And then also being able to say affordable means 30% of your income paid towards your housing. Affordable could mean you don't have a lot of income and we have to adjust for your maybe a disability, or you have a different need for your housing that you just can't find in the regular market. We also provide supports to landlords through our Housing Choice Voucher Program, where that if someone comes in and they're not able to afford that housing, we help support the rent so that we support landlords in this community as well.
Okay. How is the work that you do tied to economic development? Because, and here's why I asked that question. I first started to really encounter this notion of affordable housing or the importance of it working in the nonprofit space. And I would attend community meetings, maybe to talk about a program that the nonprofit provided or what have you. And I would hear people talk about affordable housing or a development that they were concerned about in their community, or just general shifts and change that people were focused on. And it seems like in some ways to be kind of thought of as like a bulwark against displacement. And yet I look at some of the programs that you offer and the way you think about it, and even the way that Chief Lane framed it earlier, and I think about the pathways to prosperity and economic stability and growth that could be there too. How do you approach those ideas in the work that you do?
So from a development perspective, it gives me kind of a unique approach. So we look at the housing stock that we have. We look at the housing across the city and we say, where can we have the greatest impact? Oftentimes the communities that are the least engaged in economic success in the community, or being able to take advantage of all of the great things in the community as they exist for them, are often economically disadvantaged. They live in public housing, or they live in housing that is substandard, less than what we could provide to them. And so when I look at how we impact communities, housing through affordable housing is usually one of the first changes that happens when a community begins to experience a transition from being very blighted to being a place that is viable economically. So what I mean by that is that we're some of the first money in. Oftentimes we're correcting for our own housing stock to improve it, to construct brand new housing, to bring in partnerships, to bring in development partners, to bring cash infusions into these communities, to eliminate the blight, to remove the old housing stock, and then build something better that is in thinking about access to employment so that it's close to jobs, and really turning the corner on some of these communities that will attract additional businesses to want to come there, and for other folks to want to come back to the community and to live without looking for opportunities for displacement, but looking for opportunities for inclusion. So that's another area that development can bring equity and really promote it.
I appreciate that. There's oftentimes in the conversations that I've encountered, there can be like a stigma associated with the rhetoric around this idea of affordability or what have you. And yet I hear you talking about this idea of being intentional, but also building better, like improving conditions. And you mentioned this is a basic human need. Well, in this case, you're improving the lived experience of folks. If there was one, or maybe not perhaps one, but if there was something in the general conversation that you encountered that you wish you could just correct, or a misunderstanding that people often have about the stigma associated to it, or how this can really be a force for good, how would you go about doing that?
Well, the first thing is I would hope to be able to introduce people to the concept that all housing is affordable housing, that everyone needs an opportunity to be able to have a decent place to live that is affordable to them. Simply because you have a lesser income, doesn't mean that you deserve a lesser quality of housing, that you deserve a lesser quality of neighborhood, that where you live is miserable because you're poor is really a crime to me. I think that if you have fewer resources, then it's up to the rest of us to help lift that quality of life, so that the city of Pittsburgh across the spectrum has the lowest our housing would be is the best perspective that, or how should I put this? The lowest quality housing is acceptable to everyone on the housing spectrum.
Right. The idea that if there is the idea of a floor or ceiling, that the floor for people's experience where we live is acceptable to them and all. Yeah.
Correct. So for instance, I wouldn't want to develop anything to tell someone else that that's where they should live if I'm not willing to live there myself. If I'm working and living in the community, that is a positive thing. And I wouldn't want to build anything or tell anyone else that that's where they should live. That's good enough for you because you're poor. That's what I would change. The concept that because of your income, you deserve less. And that's where we have to change the conversation. I'm not saying that that's a cheap concept, because housing takes money, development takes money, being able to provide the services and the supports that people need. So for instance, we have family self-sufficiency programs. We have an entire department that focuses on raising the social, economic, and health viability of these communities, so that our residents and the folks that partake in our programs are really able to grow. And so that's something I would change, is that people have to start seeing themselves as part of the housing solution and not the haves and have-nots.
One of the most notable experiences that I've had with the Housing Authority was the launch of Connect Home here in the region, and it illustrated to me how the Housing Authority and different partners can play a role in addressing the digital divide and making sure that folks have access to technology. And I think it's an example of ways that the Housing Authority assists people that folks might not know about. Could you spend a couple minutes sharing about the programs? You've mentioned some already that the Housing Authority provides, how you engage with residents and whatnot, and then especially given COVID, what that looks like for you all.
As you just mentioned, we do have a huge obligation to our residents. We have a growing number and a large number of children and young people who are still in school age. We need to make sure that they have access to technology so that they are able to continue their education. We have to be nimble enough and smart enough to make the adjustments that we need to make in a timely manner so that our residents can receive those services. And that's one of the programs that we utilize in order to make sure that that happens, so that our children are not left behind as time marches on, that their educations are able to continue through access to the internet and those type of activities. Now, another activity that we have that's really important is that we have and this might seem like a misnomer, but we have a scattered sites program. So we have residents that live anywhere throughout the city. There's a very broad swath of homes that are part of our scattered sites program. Well, one of the ideas is that we need to make sure that people understand that these opportunities are available to them, because if you've worked for 2 years and you're able to show that stable income, then you're eligible for some of these programs. I think that a misunderstanding is that individuals coming into public housing are not employed or they're not employable, and that's not true. We have a high threshold for involvement in some of our programs and a lower for others, but we always work to bring residents into and have individuals be able to take advantage of. We have a home ownership program so that individuals who do meet those higher threshold requirements are able to go into home ownership opportunities. And then, of course, working in partnership with the URA and with other development partners in the community, they're able to realize a better quality of life, having even more independence and launching out of public housing or launching out of our scatter sites into actual home ownership. So there are opportunities here in the city of Pittsburgh, and it's really something that I have to say that having worked across the country, our executive director, Castor Binion, he has really promoted that and looked for ways to be creative and smart instead of just waiting for something terrible to happen, to be nimble enough and understanding the forethought, or having the forethought to make those type of changes.
Yeah, if you're doing work serving, you know, basic need, as you so well put it, it means that you can also be responding to crisis for folks. And so being able to be nimble and proactively intentional, I think, makes a lot of sense for leadership. One last final question for you on this point, then we'll go to the URA. Given your experience around the nation, I wonder how you would share about what Pittsburgh has going for it. You know, what differentiates it from other places that you've seen. And certainly a reality from COVID, no matter which way you look, is that it's very difficult to do any kind of reliable forecasting. So much is changing, so much is evolving. But if you were to say, if you were to describe what success looks like, if you were to say, you know, we'll know the fruit of success in these ways, you know, what would that look like, you know, in the future for you?
So to answer your first question, I think that what Pittsburgh has going for it is that it is a leadership team and a togetherness. I struggle to put it into words because you don't see it often, where you have individuals that are working together on a daily, weekly basis in order to promote these type of activities. There are communities where housing is an afterthought, where they do not put housing as a priority. They may deal with it once it becomes a crisis in say, homelessness, but not at the point where they're looking for ways across the board on a daily basis to figure out how housing can be further perpetuated and making sure that everybody is stably housed. And what I can say is that also Pittsburgh has going for it that it's willing to have these conversations, talking about equity, looking for ways to bring people in the door, to listen to the ideas and the thoughts of a diverse group of people, to understand that housing is just not one person's solution for everyone else's ills, but it's everybody's solution for what makes it a we place, a place where we all come together and can exist successfully. And then to the second part of your question, if I could forecast, and you have to forgive me if I need you to repeat part of that, but looking at...
Yeah, so like this idea of, it's hard to forecast because of COVID. But given what Pittsburgh has going for it and the gaps that you see, you know, what would success look like if you were to say, hey, we've really done a great job here in 4 years and 5 years? You know, what would some of the fruits of that success tree, so to speak, look like?
Well, the fruit of the success would, first of all, being able to look across the landscape of the city of Pittsburgh and be able to see where we have had impact in communities without treating any one community any differently than the other. So that means that all communities help share and bear the burden and the success of having everyone in this community be stably housed. So it's inclusion. It is no community left behind. Everybody helps lift the load. And what I could say is that in 5 years, it may not happen that quickly because housing development is, you know, sometimes a project might take you 5 years to even launch or break ground, or even longer. But what it would look like is that we continue to have these dialogues, continue to work together, and that housing is a priority and remains a priority.
I appreciate that. I'd like to go to the URA. Last but certainly not least, really excited to kind of bring this other layer of the Venn diagram of this discussion to bear, and then open it up for everyone to kind of have a conversation, you know, after this. Jessica, thank you so much for taking the time today. I'll begin with you. Could you describe the URA as you would explain it to some young people? And then I'm just wondering where your mind goes of what your thoughts are given the conversation you've heard so far.
Sure, absolutely. If it's okay, and I'll only leave the slides up for about 2 minutes, but I'm going to share my screen real fast just because it has a couple of slides that describe the URA on it.
Great.
So can everybody see that?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes. Okay. So you actually know what is the URA, and the URA, we are the Redevelopment Authority for the City of Pittsburgh, you know, the Economic Development Agency, and an agency that helps with housing. And, you know, we're here to kind of help, you know, increase the economic vitality of the city. However, if you read here what's in black, the URA is committed to creating more housing that is affordable to the average Pittsburgher, encouraging more entrepreneurship and small business development, and creating quality job creation and growth, and also developing a talented workforce. This is really, what we do and who we are. But who do we help? This is really important in this context because I've been at the URA for almost 20 years, and I really have to say that, when I first started, we worked a lot on major development in the city and bringing in major development into the city. And really, we did fund affordable housing 20 years ago, but we also funded, market rate housing, because at the time in Pittsburgh, housing was less than $1 a square foot in rent. And then I would say about 10 years ago, we saw $2 a square foot in rent. And then now we're well over $3 a square foot in rent. Just to put that in perspective, think about a 1,000 square foot apartment, right? That went from, less than $1,000 20 years ago. So a 600 square foot apartment was just so amazingly affordable, to now a 1,000 square foot apartment being over $3,000. And that's just really, I think, kind of crazy. What we needed to do was, at the time we were funding both, but now we realized 5 years ago that, as the city grew, as we started to see some growth that other cities in the east part of the country were seeing, a whole population of folks were left behind. And the Affordable Housing Task Force was created, I think, around 2015 to really study that. And Mayor Peduto and his administration and the city council, voted for the legislation to create the Housing Opportunity Fund, and then also funded it. And it has been such an honor, I think, for the URA to be able to use that as a tool to really help the individuals that need the housing tools. And the slide that crashed on me said, who do we help? Yes, we help developers, but we also help homeowners, people that want to buy a home. We help tenants. Bettina's going to talk a little bit about how we do that. But we also help existing homeowners repair their homes and things like that. So yes, we're funding the development of units because the city still has a shortage of around 20,000 affordable units, but we're also helping long-term residents with their housing needs.
Thank you, I appreciate that. So you mentioned that you've been with the URA for almost 20 years now. And this is one of those interesting Pittsburgh examples where there's this entity that's existed for a while. I looked it up, 1946, the beginning of the URA, the Urban Redevelopment Authority. Can you just speak to how the conversation around what the URA does has changed? You mentioned now that there are more recent tools that you have at your disposal, but how would you describe the change in thought over time, given your perspective?
Yeah, so, that's a great question. So, over time, we were the development agency for the city, funding large developments, removing contaminated brownfield sites, things like that. And yeah, there's still large development sites that need developed in the city. But I think the difference is we're now also really focused on the individuals. On the housing side, really helping individuals get into homeownership. From a disparity perspective, the number of African Americans that purchase a home each year is so much less than the number of white folks that purchase homes each year. And we really, in the city, need to look at that and figure out how do we address that situation. So we have programs now that are set in place to really try to help fight against some of those inequalities. Like we have a down payment closing cost assistance loan that really helps first-time home buyers get into a program. I don't know if you can see that, but it talks about down payment and closing cost assistance, and it really talks about how for folks underneath 80% AMI, which is roughly $45,000 for like a household of 3, or up to even as high as 115% AMI, which is closer to, like 70,000, they can qualify for down payment money through us to purchase their first home in the city. Because right now, what has happened, like when I talked about at the beginning, we have seen rents go sky high, right? But what we've also seen the last 20 years is mortgage rates go down. The last couple years have been a little funny with mortgage rates, but prior to that, the last 10 years, mortgage rates have gone, steadily downward. What does that mean? That means that for, average Pittsburgher making $50,000 or even less, in some respects, $30,000 or $35,000, they can buy a house and their mortgage payment be less than an affordable unit, really, for rent. So we really, as the URA and the city, need to find ways to help with that. And the website that Oliver talked about, is a good starting point. And these tools through the Housing Opportunity Fund is also a good starting point. And also we can't forget about the long-term residents in the city who purchased their home 30 or 40 years ago and have paid their taxes and have been really good city residents and need a little bit of help fixing up their house because they live on a fixed income. And we have a program for that. We have the homeowner assistance program that can help fix up folks' homes up to $30,000 worth of repairs. That's another tool that the Housing Opportunity Fund has given us, and that the URA is very honored to administer.
That's great. Okay, Bettina, let's bring it to you real fast. Thanks for taking the time today and listening so patiently to all of the voices on the call. I wonder where your mind goes with this conversation and what specific programs you'd like to share with folks today. And then I'd like to talk more about the ecosystem of folks that you all work with.
Yeah, definitely. So I'm going to provide a pretty concentrated version of the information that the URA offers. But again, if you have any questions about anything that Jessica and I discussed today, definitely reach out to the URA or visit our website at ura.org for more information. In regards to this conversation, I just wanted to touch on a couple of programs that the URA, in conjunction with the City of Pittsburgh, participates in. One of them is Welcoming Pittsburgh. It is housed in the mayor's office and it spearheads the diversity and immigrant initiatives throughout the city. The city and the URA is also part of a cohort called Welcoming Economies, which is spun off from Welcoming America. Welcoming Economies provides technical assistance to the URA's housing and business departments to help build more equitable programs throughout the city, particularly towards the immigrant and refugee communities. This first pilot program includes Pittsburgh, Louisville, and Urbana-Champaign. So through our partnership with Welcoming Pittsburgh and our work with Welcoming Economies, we are really able to build more equitable programs throughout the city and to ensure that everyone has access to services that another program that I also wanted to briefly touch on, I think all of our consumer-facing programs are so extremely important at this time. Like Jessica had mentioned, we have a program that helps with buying your first home in the city. We have a program that can assist with necessary home repairs. But I think the program that is most relevant to the current climate right now is the Housing Stabilization Program that the URA offers through the Housing Opportunity Fund. So through the Housing Stabilization Program, we do provide rental and utility assistance to renters at households at 50% AMI or below, and we also provide mortgage assistance to households at 80% AMI or below who live in the city. Just to clarify, AMI stands for Area Median Income. It is a figure calculated by HUD to help determine the level of need for each household. The figures are adjusted each year to accommodate for inflation and fluctuating household income. So this program was launched July of last year through the Housing Opportunity Fund. It has been part of the Housing Opportunity Fund's portfolio of programs that have been operational since 2018. But since COVID-19 hit, the demand for the program just increased dramatically. Within the first couple of days since when the pandemic hit our region specifically, we had received over 500 inquiries about this program. Now, not all of those who inquired about the program were eligible primarily because they lived outside of the city of Pittsburgh, but the demand for this program has just been so high. One of the things to come out of the pandemic, though, is that we had to take a deeper dive into our program to assess like which program policies are working and which aren't. Are we unintentionally excluding or deterring specific populations from being able to access our programs? And if so, we need to address those issues. So the housing team at the URA were able to develop and amend the housing stabilization program to take into consideration the immediate and the long-term effects of COVID-19. So as you'll see, some of the things that we had changed included how we collect identification. Most of the HSP processes have been moved online virtually to accommodate for the pandemic, but we do also have one service provider that still conducts in-person appointments for clients who may not have access to documentation electronically or may not feel comfortable completing the intake online. Documentation that we collect for income, we are more flexible about as well, and how we calculate income, and then also just being more flexible on checking city and county taxes. That's something that we have to do for due diligence on our program, but that will not be a reason why someone's denied. And then the other slide, Jessica, forward, also talks about language access. So when the pandemic hit, we immediately implemented a coordinated entry system through United Way 211 to be able to better address the high demand for the program. The traffic for the program was just so high that we needed something that was able to answer people's phone calls 24/7, which United Way 211 can do. And then with the coordinated entry system in place, we also brought on additional service providers to administer the housing stabilization program. So in March, we had 5, now we have 12. And 2 of those agencies are actually geared towards helping specific populations. The Jewish Family and Community Services primarily will help the immigrant, refugee, and then limited English language speakers. And then also we have the Veterans Leadership Program, which will help the veteran population as well. These are just some demographics of the program to date. So we have processed over 1,000 applications for this program so far. A majority of the households are minority head of households that are female, and also under at or below the 30% AMI mark, with about 22% being between the 30 and 50% AMI, and then 3% homeowners. Majority of these households have tied their housing insecurity directly to COVID-19, and we expect that just to increase in the future.
Bettina, could you say that last part again? You said something about the families tying these realities to COVID?
Yeah, so one of the questions we ask is your housing situation or your need for the stabilization program directly tied to COVID? And a majority of the households since March have said yes, that their need is tied directly to COVID. And as you know, the long-term effects of COVID set in, we're expecting that number to increase almost to 100% connected to COVID.
It's extraordinary. Thank you so much for that, Bettina. And I'd like to just open it up to, to everybody here. Here's when I listen to this conversation, here's what I see. We have this enormous topic, housing. It's related to people's basic needs. It's related to their people's economic stability, potential for growth. It's related to their ability to ensure good educational outcomes for their kids and stuff like that. And yet it's also one that's being impacted by COVID and the recent economic distress. It's also one where there's been a lot of ongoing activity related to it at different levels of government and our nonprofit space and all of that. And yet I see even for all of these large scale considerations, both the Housing Authority and the URA have programs down to the specific individual that can be assisted with whatever it is that they're facing. So I'm just wondering when you all think about these realities, what would you want people to take away from this conversation as it relates to their own setup, and like how would you encourage them to start learning about and taking advantage of these resources for anybody?
So I would like to say that, one takeaway that I would like people who are viewing this to know is that there is help and there is assistance out there. There are programs that we can help with, and I encourage you to reach out to 211 or to the URA to help, ask questions. There most likely is a program that can help you, but the URA is here to help, and we want to ensure that you can shelter in place during this time. That's of utmost importance and one of the primary focuses and functions of this housing stabilization program. So definitely reach out because help is available.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Yeah, I just would say, I think what you've heard, whether it's the housing authority talking about the great work they're doing and kind of working with their residents around evictions and eviction innovation, or whether it's in conjunction with the Commission on Human Relations, or if it's the URA talking about the work that they're doing. Really, what you see is there is a thrusted, concerted effort, and again, there's a larger ecosystem around it, but this represents a government thrust to make sure that people are stable, that people are okay, and that during times the likes of which we haven't seen, that we're able to kind of take care of our residents. And I think it's also important when you look at some of those numbers, that it's important to know that who's using this. People using this are the people who have been negatively impacted by all the things we talked around economy, education. And so while we're working on those other things, we also know that people need to be a shelter in place. People need to be able to be stable. And then as it is relevant, right, people also need these pathways to opportunity. They need to be able to go on a site and maybe use a different language. Like Tina talked about our partnership with Welcoming Pittsburgh and Welcoming Economies, right? So what we're trying to really do is present the broadest kind of scope of how we're serving the citizens, acknowledging that the scale of the issue is massive. But I think the way that the housing authority, the URA, and the city is looking to pivot in response to that is a really it's a positive thing, and it's something that we can look forward to as we continue to think about what does this innovation look like, having the citizen really in mind and the citizen at heart at how we serve them, and act as a base, as a foundation, right? We're not trying to be anyone's ceiling. We're trying to be the floor and create a floor to be the base for their growth and development in our great city. So
yeah, and I want other people to weigh in here. Chief, you talk about this idea of supporting people no matter who they are. Look at the numbers that they just shared, and we talk about equity. The breakdown by sex: 82% female, by race, 74% African American. So often we talk about equity, and it remains in this kind of fuzzy field of something we'd like to see. And yet, if you look at the numbers on how these partnerships and how these governmental agencies, how these teams are functioning, there is an equity reality right there. Does that say?
Well, absolutely. And I think, again, going back to the idea, the definition of equity being like, you cannot use race, gender, class, neighborhood to start to define the quality of life, like Monique talked about. And, you want quality housing that anyone would want to live in, right? So no matter where people are, you want quality, safe, clean housing that they can live in. And we know that resources need to go to those who have suffered the most. We know that resources are going to those who have had the broader challenges due to the structural impediments that have happened. And we acknowledge that that is happening. And I think that the resources and who it's going to, and I also want to give a lot of credit to the work, again, that the URA, the Housing Authority, and many of the community partners like Pittsburgh United, as well as Omocello and others, as many as the housing stabilization partners, a lot of the great work that they do is really engaging people where they are, acknowledging where people are and engaging them where they are to be able to get the resources to who needs them, even if, they may not be in the systems or talking to a whole bunch of people. We want to be able to get to those in need and help them in that way to shelter in place while we look at what are the pathways of opportunity going forward. So I think it really is a conversation that really brings equity right to the heart of it. And you see it, and you're leading with equity. You're leading with trying to help those who've been impacted in order to stabilize and keep people safe while we go through this tumultuous time.
Thank you. Monique, Jessica, Oliver, I'd love for you to weigh in here to the extent you feel comfortable. Because there's this idea of this topic, then there's the idea of like the programs that are available or the resources that are available, and then there's the idea of how do you get that information out? And what I've heard each of you speak to a certain extent is how you go about doing that. Maybe it's through a portal, like Oliver was saying, with different languages. Maybe it's doing a broadcast like this where you take some time to just kind of walk through what's available and stuff like that. When you think about how you can reach folks where they're at, given that that's what we want to do and that's the purpose, how do we go about doing that successfully?
Yeah, just to highlight and piggyback off what Fatina and Chief Lane just mentioned, I do think it's very important for, and I encourage those to reach out for for different programs and the resources via 211 to the URA, utilizing the HARP website or 311. At least in my work, speaking specifically for myself, I found that I need to be more diligent in how I'm promoting and marketing what is going on and bringing it to the forefront. As Chief Lane just spoke to, meeting people directly where they're at, to where I live in this world where I'm always paying attention to what's going on in civic spaces and in government. And some people don't watch the news. Some people don't get press releases. So just making sure we're taking every avenue possible to meet people where they are, in the spaces they are within the community, whether that be at rec centers, libraries, places of worship, to Facebook, social media, is taking as many different avenues as possible to meet people specifically where they are, and then having the resources in place that they can reach out to the various organizations, whether that be the City of Pittsburgh, URA, or 311, or that the information is already readily available in their community. So the community leaders and the organizations and the CDCs also have it, so they're able to be our sounding boards for specific things. In my personal opinion, I challenge myself weekly, daily to be better at promoting what we're doing, and that it's more easily accessible to people.
Yeah, and to jump in, one of the things that I think is really important and critical is that we look at the residents as the housing authority. We have done this. We look at the residents we serve, but then we also look at the businesses in the community or the landlords that are impacted by the fact that our residents are impacted. And so looking for ways to reach out to landlords and make sure that they understand, yes, they may have a tenant that is recipient of a housing choice voucher or Section 8 as it formerly was known, and they're able to call the housing authority and find out what resources are available to them, or some of our development partners and the properties that we're currently developing. Even just sitting down and have a problem-solving conversation around how we can help promote what we're continuing to do through COVID, and being available and accessible for those type of problem-solving conversations, and being a resource for those that are deeply impacted as it kind of spreads out. It's like the impact is the drop of water, but the ripples impact our entire community.
Thank you for that. Jessica, what do you think in relation to this part of the conversation?
Yes, I mean, I echo what everyone's saying about just please reach out. I mean, there is a program for you somehow. Housing stability is, such a personal thing to people, right? But it's the livelihood, it's their ability to keep a roof over their family's head. And we are here for them, because here's one way I think the URA is different now than we were before. And that is, if somebody calls and we don't have a program for them, now we know somebody that does. I mean, the network of providers, the network of government agencies is just so strong right now that we will try to get you in the right place. I also don't think anyone's mentioned that the city financial empowerment centers to date yet, but the City of Pittsburgh sponsors something called financial empowerment centers. And there are free financial counselors that can sit and meet with you for, I think, like an hour a day for like up to 8 hours or something like that. About really anything that you need or want from a financial perspective. So if you want to just know, how do I save an extra $50 a month? How do I save an extra $100 a month? Or how do I start to save for home ownership? Or how do I pay off some of my credit card debt? Please, reach out to them through Neighborhood Allies, or you could contact us or the mayor's office to get in contact with them. But my email is jsmithperry@ura.org. Email me anything. I will have a URA staff person, get in contact with you as soon as possible.
That's terrific.
And I also did want to briefly mention, since we're talking about meeting people where they are and what methods we're utilizing to do that, I just wanted to quickly mention URA is getting out of a program called the Community Engagement Ambassadors Program. So this is to help clients who are interested in the Housing Stabilization Program navigate the Housing Stabilization Program application and documentation collection. So the community engagement ambassadors could be organizations or community advocates who work heavily within the community to help recruit clients to this program who may not necessarily get our information through the internet, through the website, through press releases. We actually have people on the ground in the community handing out information, educating the public on what programs are available to them, and then helping coordinate the different types of resources that are available to them, including the Housing Stabilization Program. The Community Ambassadors Program is going to be administered through Amacello, and the RFP is going to go out tomorrow. If you are interested in helping clients fill out this Housing Stabilization application and help navigate the process, we definitely encourage you to apply for the RFP. But the whole goal for the Community Engagement Program, Ambassadors Program, is to meet people where they are and to help build relationships with the community and understand that clients may not feel comfortable applying for a government program and they may feel more comfortable talking with someone that they're familiar with who already works in the community with them to seek out resources and information. And so we are really working on just getting this information out there in as many ways as possible, especially given the challenge of COVID-19, where meeting in person in large groups or in large community settings may not be possible. We still want to ensure that everyone is getting the information as timely as possible.
Thank you for that. And we'll make sure that the chat is linked up, and our team members have been paying attention to make sure that there are links in the chat for folks. And certainly you can go to each of the websites that have been mentioned from the organizations that are on the call and learn more there as well. And as it may seem clear, reach out to these team members to learn more and to engage with their teams. You know, if I think about takeaways for folks from this conversation, I think about the idea of hope, because one of the realities with COVID is a sense of hopelessness and despair, which is so much outside of our control. And certainly housing is not often a simple conversation. But what I'm taking away is that, as represented by each of you and the organizations you work for, there are people that with expertise. There are indeed resources. There are places where you can learn more information. And I think this is important, there are interfaces to make that easier. There are one-stop shops now where you can get a whole bunch of information at once. There are financial empowerment centers where people will just walk you through it. Is it budgeting so you can save $50 extra, or is it learning about how you can put yourself in a position to buy a first home and what programs are available? Is it setting up a fund for your potential children to go to college? You know, you can actually walk with another human being through this, and instead of signing up for some faceless government program, have a chance to forge a relationship with someone that can be impactful. And that reality speaks to a lot of the folks on this call and the leadership in the city that we have right now, because it's not immediately obvious how, say, a mayor's office can be a good partner in this very complicated arena, or even just the organizations that are on this call right now, like how you interface with each of them effectively. But leadership has been intentional for some time. This is where we're at in long-term conversations, and there are resources and ways for folks to receive assistance. Let's bring this conversation to a close, my friends. Any final encouragements for those that are watching? And since you all have done such a good job on pointing to the resources for your organizations and places that they can learn more, anything just on a personal note as you think about the conversation we've had that you would say to people that might be listening, for them in this time?
I just would say to know that there is an acknowledgement by institutions that serve you, that serve the residents of our city, that there is a challenge and that people are doing their best to rise to the levels of the challenge that we see, to make sure that all of our residents have access to the benefits of what the city can bring to the table, and that if it's as the mayor often says, if it's not for all of us, not for any of us. So we know that people are comfortable. People are doing okay, and if they have access to healthy and affordable and clean housing and opportunity, we want every resident to have that same access.
Thank you, sir. Anybody else? All right. Well, thank you all so much, for your time. I've learned, so much on the call. I want to thank both of our interpreters, Megan and Iris, for their time as well. And to all of you, or any of you that have taken the time to be with us on the call today, please check the chat for the resources that were mentioned and look these folks up online to engage more with them and learn from them. We're going to continue with the series to unpack realities related to COVID and equity and really just give folks a chance to get to learn about the people that are here, working on these issues during our time during COVID, but also thinking about, the future and how we make, a brighter future for all, as the mayor likes to say. So in the meantime, please take the very best care of yourselves, and we'll see you next time.